Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to your English online class. Today we will do Chapter 11 The Portrait of a Lady from New Images. Chapter 11 The Portrait of a Lady Who Had Always Been Old. Before you read, Kushwant Singh was an Indian journalist and author. After completing his school, Singh went to the prestigious St. Stephen's College, Delhi University, and later studied law at King's College, London. Inspired by the horrifying events during the partition of India in 1947, he wrote his first novel, Train to Pakistan, in 1956. He also wrote a comprehensive history of the Sikh community titled The History of the Sikhs. His other major works include The Mark of Vishnu and Other Stories, Truth, Love, and a Little Malice, and The Sunset Club. In 2007, he was awarded the Padma Vibhushan for his life's work. The portrait of a lady is taken from the short story collection, The Mark of Vishnu and Other Stories. Kushwant Singh wrote in simple English using a good quantity of humor and irony in his writing. The story is a biographical sketch of the writer's grandmother and shows the relationship he enjoyed with her. Before reading the chapter, let us know the summary of the story, The Portrait of a Lady. In The Portrait of a Lady, Kushwant Singh has given an account of his grandmother. He draws a life-like portrait. She was very old. Her face was wrinkled. Her hair was white. It was hard to believe that once she had been young and pretty. His grandfather's picture hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban. His clothes were loose. He looked at least 100 years old. It was hard to believe that he had once a wife or children. Kushwant Singh's grandmother was a short lady. She was fat and slightly bent. She couldn't walk straight. She hobbled about the house. She had to keep one hand on her waist. It was to balance her stoop. In the other, she held a rosary. She was always telling the beads. Her lips constantly moved in prayer. She put on white clothes. Her silver locks scattered over her pale face. She looked like snowy mountains in winter. She was a picture of peace and contentment. She was very old. Perhaps she could not have looked older. She looked the same for the last 20 years. Kushwant Singh and his grandmother were good friends. His parents went to city. They left him with her in the village. She took good care of him. She used to wake him up in the morning. She got him ready for the school. She said her morning prayer in sing-song manner. She hoped that he would learn it by heart. He liked her voice but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch his wooden slate. She had already washed it and plastered it with yellow chalk. She would take an earthen ink pot and a reed pen. She would tie them in a bundle and hand it to him. She would give him a thick slate chapati with little butter and sugar spread on it. It was his breakfast. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. His grandmother always went to school with him. The school was attached to the temple. The priest taught children the alphabet and the morning prayer. The children sat in 2 rows in the veranda. They could sing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. The grandmother sat inside the temple. She would read holy books. Then they would walk home together. The village dogs would gather at the temple door. They threw chapatis to them. The dogs would growl and fight with each other. The narrator's parents sent for them in the city. It was a turning point in their friendship. They shared the same room, but grandmother no longer went to school with him. The narrator used to go to an English school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the streets, so grandmother took to feeding the sparrows. Years rolled by. They saw less of each other. Sometimes he would ask him what the teacher had taught him. She did not believe in the things they taught at the English school. She was unhappy. She did not like English or science. She felt sad that there was no teaching about God and the scriptures at school. The narrator one day told her that they were being given music lessons. She was disturbed. She thought music quite indecent. For her, it was good only for prostitutes and beggars. It was not meant for gentlefolk. The narrator went to university. He was given a room of his own. The common link of friendship was broken. The grandmother accepted her loneliness quietly. She was always busy with her spinning wheel and reciting prayers. She rarely talked to anyone. In the afternoon, she relaxed for a while. Then she would feed the sparrows. She sat in the veranda. She broke the bread into little bits. Then she would throw them to sparrows. Hundreds of sparrows came there. They created the hell of noise. Some came and sat on her legs. Others would sit on her shoulders. Some would sit even on her head. She smiled but never frightened them away. Feeding the sparrows was the happiest half hour of the day for her. The narrator decided to go abroad for higher studies. He was to remain away for 5 years. The grandmother was very old. She could die any moment. The narrator was worried, but the grandmother was not upset. She showed no emotion. She came to the railway station to see him off. Her lips moved in prayer. Her mind was lost in prayer. Her fingers were busy telling the beads of her rosary. She kissed his forehead silently. The narrator thought that it was the last sign of physical contact between them. The narrator returned home after 5 years. His grandmother met him at the station. She did not look a day older. She did not speak anything. She held him in her arms. She went on reciting her prayers. In the afternoon, she fed the sparrows as usual. In the evening, a change came over her. She didn't pray. She collected the women of the neighborhood. She got an old drum. She continued thumping the old drum for several hours. She started singing. She sang of the homecoming of warriors. They had to persuade her to stop. She might overstrain herself. It was for the first time that she had forgotten to pray. The next morning she fell ill. She had a mild fever. She told them that her end was near. She realized that she had forgotten to pray. She didn't want to talk. It would be waste of time. She ignored their request. She lay peacefully in bed. She was praying and telling beads. Then her lips stopped moving. The rosary fell down from her lifeless fingers. Her face looked pale but peaceful. She was dead. She was laid on the ground. She was covered with a red shawl. Agreements for her funeral were being made. It was evening. The sun was setting. They brought a wooden stretcher. They stopped halfway in the courtyard. Thousands of sparrows sat near her dead body. They did not chirp. Everyone felt sorry for the birds. The narrator's mother brought some bread. She broke it into little crumbs. She threw these crumbs to the sparrows. The birds took no notice of them. Then they carried her dead body outside. The sparrows flew away quietly. The crumbs of bread still remained lying there in the courtyard. Evidently, the sparrows had come to mourn the death of the grandmother. To sum up, the portrait of a lady summary, the writer and his grandmother had a beautiful bond between them and loved each other a lot. The story tells us how beautiful a relationship can become between a grandson and his grandmother. I hope everyone understood the summary of the chapter. There are few more things to add it, which is the portrait of a lady is a part of an autobiography by Kushwant Singh. In this autobiography by Kushwant Singh, he draws a pen portrait of his old grandmother. He loves her immensely. Can you give a brief character sketch of Kushwant Singh's grandmother on the basis of the portrait of a lady? Yes. The writer's grandmother was a very old woman. She was religious minded and noble hearted. In the house, she always carried a rosary in her hands. She kept telling the beads of the rosary and reciting prayers silently. She read holy books in the village temple. She would say her prayers while getting the child ready for school. She used it to feed the dogs in the village and the sparrows in the city. She treated the author with the utmost affection. The author was sent abroad for 5 years for further studies. He thought that this might upset his grandmother, but she did not object and went to the railway station to see him off. When he returned after 5 years, she was there to welcome him. She was so happy that she collected the women in the neighborhood and sang songs and beat the drum to celebrate his homecoming. She was not formally educated. She had no knowledge of English and science, but she was serious about the education of her grandson. She even helped him with his lessons in the village, but she was distributed to know that music lessons were being given at the city school. It pained her to note that there was no teaching about God and holy books. She hated music. She belonged to the old generation. This is all for today. Stay home, stay healthy. Thank you.